Hello and welcome back to Philosophy and Humor. This is Module 7, also known as the Online Midterm Test Week. And this test will be on from February the 22nd until the 27th. Of course, it's online. It will be 2 hours long, but let me get into the details in just a few minutes. So what you need to know is the material from the first half of this course. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment here. I've got basically my cheat sheets, we'll call them. But I just want to give you the sort of the breakdown of the test. We talked about it a little bit a few weeks ago and at the very beginning of the course, but let's go through it again. As you can see, it will be available online for basically roughly a week. It's 120 minutes long, so you have 2 hours to finish the test. Most people, especially if you're typing on a keyboard, you can probably whip through this thing in literally an hour at the most. So don't let the 2 hour time limit terrify you or cause you anxiety. You won't need 2 hours, but it's there. Okay, so what do we have? We've got 4 sections here: true, false, identify and explain, short answer questions, and long answer question singular. So let's break it down even more. True, false questions are exactly that. Don't worry about who said what. Worry more about what was said. And what do I mean by that? It doesn't matter who I assign a particular statement. Worry more so about what is being said. If I say something really outrageous about superiority theory or about incongruity theory or relief theory, any of those things, don't worry about who said it. Now, if you can remember that, great. But worry more about what's being said. What are some of the main ideas that we discussed over the last month and a half as we went through this material? So if you have that in mind, you'll do just fine. Just read the question carefully, and I've gone through it to make sure there's no mistakes in grammar and spelling stuff. So they're pretty straightforward. They're no trick questions, but worry more so about what's being said. In other words, let's say if it's the statement starts, according to Plato, comma, the following. It could be Bozo the Clown. It could be anybody. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Plato said it. What matters is what was said. If it's something about superiority theory or incongruity, and it sounds pretty reasonable, it's likely right. So I stress this because a lot of people get anxious over remembering who said what. Okay, so Plato said this, and Henri Bergson said that, and Hobbes says. Don't worry about that. Worry more about what the entire statement consists of. So there are 10 true-false questions. Do I identify and answer all 10? And basically, you're just going to click true or false. Very straightforward. The second part is identify and explain. Now here, there's a choice. I think I looked at it as maybe 12 to 14 different choices. So what that means is you're going to identify only 5 of them. So you have a choice. And most things, like if you're like me, some things just kind of stick to you. You just remember them. And some things you kind of have to work at it a little bit. That's where there's some breathing room. So identify and explain. They're very straightforward. Answer the ones that you know well. You do not have to answer all of them. Like I say, it's 12 or 14 of them. First of all, it's only out of 10 marks, and there are 5 of them. So if you give me 2 sentences, identify what it is and explain what it is. And that's it. That is literally it. The third section, there, like the true false, you've got to answer all 5 of the questions, and they're only worth 3 points, right? 3 marks. So it's a total of 15. But if you can give me 3 sentences regarding the answer to the question, and I've even broken it down so that the question, although they're short answer questions, if I remember correctly, last time I looked, and it wasn't that long ago, there's like 3 short questions. Even if you are strategic and go, I'm going to answer in 1 sentence each one of those questions. 3 out of 3. That's all. I'm trying to make this as easy as I can. I don't want you to sweat over this, right? It's meant to be an elective. You're taking this course because, you have an interest in it. I don't want to kill that. Okay, so short answer questions. You have to answer all 5. Read them carefully. And really 3 or 4 sentences will be more than enough to answer. And the last one, I used to call them essay questions, but let's just call them long answer questions. And that's only comparatively speaking to the short answer questions. Now there, it's a total of 15 marks. Now, Sounds like a lot more. It is, but you have a choice. I think there's 4 different questions. So whichever question you are more comfortable or most comfortable with, answer that one. Make life easy for yourself. So when you are looking through the long answer questions, pick the one that you feel most comfortable with, that you think you can answer the easiest and with, the greatest efficiency. Remember, you've got 2 hours, so again, don't sweat it. But it's worth 15 marks. Now, 15 marks doesn't mean I need 15 sentences. It could be, the diction's really interesting, the example is really good, you really have got a good grasp on what this idea is about, and it just looks good, it just reads well, right? That could be 15 out of 15. So if you want to look at it and be strategic and say, I must answer, write 15 sentences, that's fine. But having said that, the long answer question can also be written in point form. Okay, it's not an English essay. I'm not marking you on, let's say, a writ exam where you've got an introductory paragraph and a conclusion and the body paragraphs. If you prefer to write this way, have at it, right? Knock yourself out. But if you prefer to simply write it in point form, that's fine too. All I care about is what's on the screen. When I bring up the answer to the question, as long as I can see something, whether it's point form or it's in an essay form, we'll say, with some kind of an introduction or conclusion, I've got a fair amount of latitude with these things. So I'm not going to worry so much about the structure of it. So the online midterm test for 120 minutes on between the 22nd and the 27th has 4 sections, plural. True, false, worth 10 marks. Identify and explain, where there's some choice, worth 10 marks. Short answer questions, worth 15 marks. And a long answer question. You'll have a choice of 4, answer only 1. And again, that's a choice and it's worth 15 marks. Okay, so, excuse me. Let's take a look at what we were talking about right from the very beginning, which is Module 2. Module 1 is just a course introduction, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, if you want to be, again, strategic about your the way you sort of absorb the material, certainly you can go through the slides, or if you have time to go through the video lectures, that's fine. But take a look at the beginning of each of the set of slides, starting with Module 3. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to have a summary of all the important parts, of which I'm going to read right now. Now, by all means, please do rewatch this if you like. You can even close your eyes and listen and imagine I'm about to hypnotize you. How's that? Okay, so Module 2, we talked about the origins and evolution of humor. And we said here that there were sort of 4 main types: superiority, incongruity, relief, and play. And play is kind of sort of a theory, play, creativity, because really play is at work in all of the kind of joke telling and humor that we have. So it kind of informs all of them. So it's not a specific theory, but it does inform the other 3 for sure. And we talked about, for example, that humor has its origins in the Latin word humor, right, which means humor. And it actually refers to liquids in our body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And when all 4 of those fluids are in balance, a person is considered healthy. And these days, someone is considered to be in good humor if they are healthy and happy, or healthy and hale, as used to say. No one uses that word anymore, spelled H-A-L-E, by the way. So to have your 4 fluids in balance means that you're healthy, you're in good humor, you have a sense of humor, and it not only was a good thing health-wise, but to have a sense of humor was something worth cultivating. And this is an idea that really came into its own in the 19th century, so in the 1800s. To have a capacity for humor, or to have a sense of humor, was considered a virtue. It was a good thing. And not only that, but it was a human activity. It was an almost exclusively human activity. And I say almost because I don't speak dolphin or dog, so I don't know. I've never seen a dog laugh, but I'm sure there's some YouTube video out there that some beagle is laughing his head off. I haven't seen it yet. But the point is that humor could be used as a social lubricant. So there was something socially valuable about having a sense of humor. Now, we talked about the differences between amusement, laughter, comedy, and humor. Amusement is just the enjoyment of something that's subtle, a kind of conceptual shift, a kind of like, what? Right? One of these kinds of things. Not a WTF, but just a what? And it brings a smile, right? You don't really start laughing. But what's happening is our attention is sort of agreeably preoccupied and sort of, our attention is on something that is just kind of mildly goofy. That's amusement. Now, laughter, on the other hand, that's a physiological response, and it can exist without humor. Some of you wrote about that in your first evaluation essay, the difference between the two. Laughter is physiological. It's a response to not only humor, but also anxiety and stress, nervousness, being afraid, tickling someone. All those things can elicit humor, but can elicit laughter. Let's be clear on that. So, what's happening with humor is it's a worldview. It's a kind of a mental construct of the world. Laughter is physiological and humor is cerebral, right, or psychological. So it has to do with the way we see the world. So if comedy is content or is the content of a joke, then humor is its form, right? So comedy is what the joke is about, and humor is the way in which we laugh at it. Do we laugh at it from a position of superiority? Do we laugh at it from a position of recognizing some incongruity? Or are we laughing because it gives us a sense of relief? So the way in which we laugh at something, the why of a joke, that's humor. What we're laughing at is comedy. So that was important. There was the similarity between humor and philosophy. Both involve emotional detachment, especially from the practical aspects of life. Both cultivate a rational and objective view of the world, and both also stress conceptual flexibility, right? That psychological flexibility to think outside the box, or to stick handle, whatever metaphor you want to use. So we can use, in a very imaginative kind of way, different perspective on a particular situation. Again, humor is our ability to engage in mock verbal aggression with another person. We can put down another person in a humorous kind of way, and the result is that the person understands that it is a joke, and they can respond in kind. I think one of the best examples right now, there's a series on Netflix called Superstore. Highly recommended. Very, very funny, but also very real. If you've ever worked with other people and like in the public, whether it's a grocery store, hardware store, a big box store, you'll love this show. And it is full of mock aggression, full of mock put downs, and people accept it for what it is. We watch it and we don't get upset because we know it's a comedy. But even the characters seem to kind of take it in stride. And even sometimes the responses are so over the top, they just kind of, the only response is to laugh. Okay, so all these different aspects are important. But the fact that we can sort of aggressively engage with other people, we can verbally spar with them through humor. Humor is also a place where social norms are set aside, right? Those categories that bind us together, they can be set aside so we can think in a more creative kind of way. That's important. And the last question, too, that we looked at the first week is humor and emotion. Now, those that say that yes, it is, we say so for the following reasons. Both have an object, which acts as a stimulant, the joke. Both have a causal relationship with their object. We read it or hear it or see it and we laugh. Both can be experienced in varying degrees. We can laugh a little bit or a lot. We can be only mildly afraid or very much afraid and we run. So there's a degree of experience. Both can already be partially suppressed or stifled, and depending where we are. We have to really stifle a laugh at a funeral or somewhere where it's inappropriate. And then finally, both are infectious around others. Now, if we're in love, I don't know if that can be infectious, or you'd want to be in love with one other person, and you'd hope that would happen. But the notion of the infectious nature of joy, for example, someone joyous and smiling, it makes other people feel good, right? So there's that. Okay, so it would be allowing you to say that humor is an emotional state for all those reasons. Now, those of you that disagree, amusement takes place at a higher level, right, than simply just laughing. It demands a higher level of cognitive development. cognitive awareness. The amusement associated with humor depends on our ability to enjoy having our reputations about the world, or expectations, I should say, about the world violated in some way. And this requires a different kind of thinking. With emotions, we simply respond almost instinctively. When we respond to something that is incongruous, we're having to match up what we are seeing with what we should be seeing. And that's a mental construct. So, unlike fear, which is an emotion with a practical purpose, hey, there's a line behind you, right? Humor is a state of mind that is not being practical at all. It's either being, it's kind of being playful. It's having fun with words. So that's the first set of module slides. Module 3, we talked about earliest philosophies on humor. We talked about Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. Plato associated laughter and humor with our more base instincts. He didn't think it was a very good thing because it upsets our nature, our self-control, our intellectual seriousness, because Plato is all about being serious. And really, it points out a kind of malicious interaction with another person. It's malice, right, that we're feeling towards that other person when we're laughing. That epic fail that we see other people do, and thankfully it's not us. That's where that malicious nature is really not showing the best part of us. And that's the part that Plato does not like. Excuse me. Because of that, Plato thought that literature should be censored. Poets, for example, should be censored, because he thought that anything that would elicit laughter was always, no matter what, associated with malice, except for one thing. If humor and comedy could be used for educational purposes. If you could be pedagogical, right, it's educational, in your use of humor, and you are, teaching someone through humor, Plato thought that was okay. Now, Aristotle comes along, and of course, this is really the superiority theory. Aristotle comes along, and he agrees somewhat with Plato, but he says, it doesn't always have to be associated with immoral and malicious behavior. Sometimes we can look at things, that have no bearing on a person. It's not an attack on a person. We can just see things as being ludicrous, just being strange and bizarre, but only to the degree that we laugh. If they're too bizarre, then we become frightened, and it becomes a horror movie and not a comedy. So we derive pleasure from the ludicrous, that is only to a certain degree, or the incongruous. And Aristotle also says, yes, laughter shows contempt for others because we're being amused by someone else who is considered socially inferior in some way. Now, we also laugh because we consider someone's shortcomings as minor. Again, this is this issue that we have today, where someone, will laugh at another person's behavior. But these days, if we're going to do that, we need to be very careful. We laugh at something someone can correct. We just do not make fun, or we should not make fun of people who don't deserve to be made fun of because of a lifelong disability. That's not humorous. That's not the subject of humor. But something that is minor, that could be corrected. Therein lies that kind of educational part that Plato talks about. If we can point that out through humor, then we're able to use humor in the way that Plato and Aristotle believed it was correct. Aristotle also thought that we could use humor in a tactful sort of way, to cultivate the necessary virtues such as wit, that we can rise above it, and we can have a humorous outlook on life. That doesn't mean we spend our entire day laughing, running up and down the street, because then people will think there's something wrong with us. But instead, what he's talking about is just be able to laugh at the things that really shouldn't concern us to any great degree, right? Don't sweat the small stuff, is what he meant. Now, the last person we looked at was Cicero. And there was a lot of relationship between Aristotle and Cicero, because both were really kind of saying the same sort of thing, that there was an educational component to humor and to laughter. The way people say things, what they do can also be the source of humor. And the laughable, right, can be found in some sort of offensive or deformity, but of a minor kind. That's important. So incongruity can be used as a feature of comedy for Cicero, because as an orator, right, a public speaker, we can use humor to a certain degree where we can twist the truth a little bit in order to add levity, to add wit to our speech. So Cicero was really the first person to say that, look, a speaker should be allowed to stray from literal facts in order to try to tell a joke. But again, not so much that we don't recognize the situation anymore. We need to still be able to do that to be able to enjoy the joke. So he says we can stray from the literal truth for the sake of the joke. So there is still, and this is what makes Cicero's ideas quite modern, at least in my mind, is that there is truth behind the comic fabrication. Behind the joke is some grain of truth that we recognize as such. And we see it and we go, yeah, I think I know what he's talking about here. So we look at it and say, yeah, there is something that we can learn from that makes it very clear to us what it is that they are talking about. Okay, so that was module 3, earliest philosophies of humor. So now we sort of break down the main 3: superiority, incongruity, and relief. So superiority theory starts with Plato, as I described it, the sort of degree of maliciousness and malice that we have towards the person that we're laughing at. And Plato says, no, that puts us in a position of superiority that we should not put ourselves in. Now, Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and Bergson each talk about the superiority theory, and I wish to stress again that none of these writers agree that this is a good thing. They're pointing out something that is really substantially wrong with humor, that we are laughing from a position of greatness that A, we don't deserve, and B, is really trying hard to make the other person look very stupid. So that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, Descartes was more concerned about the kind of mechanics of laughter, we'll call it. He had a very rational and mechanical view of the way that humor elicited laughter. The aggressive nature of laughter, that ha, right, that plosive sound. If you ever study linguistics, a plosive is like a P sound, performance. Plosives really are part of the nature of laughter. It is explosive because it's part of a punch line, right? So the language is very aggressive. So for Descartes, laughter was often related to scorn, derision, ridicule, mockery, malice, all the things that Plato was talking about. So doesn't really advance the agenda a whole lot, but really gets more concerned with how laughter is generated in the body. But in so doing, offers us some interesting ideas about superiority theory. The use of satire is something that Descartes was okay with, much like Plato. Modest bantering, right, to expose the vices of others, things that can be corrected. That's what matters. Then we get out to Thomas Hobbes, and he talks about this notion of a sudden glory. That's that aha moment where we have won over on somebody, right? And we've either caught them in a lie or we've tripped them up verbally. But whatever that sudden glory, that we feel that temporary superiority over that other person. Now that's part of, Hobbes's much grander view of life is just a one long struggle, that you've got to fight for every grain of respect that you get. So that's the way Hobbes looked at the world. So the notion of sudden glory is something that is temporarily good, was his way of looking at, that small little victory you could have over somebody else. So other people's inferiority or absurdity, that's the source of the laughter that Hobbes believes that we are tapping into. Then we get Bergson writing in the 1900s, and he had a really interesting idea of humor as being part of what he called our élan vital, right? Our life force, our vital force. And Bergson looked at humor and laughter as part of this sort of evolutionary component of our life, our creativity, our self-creation, all the things that make us truly human. Humor and laughter is part of it. It's part of that vital force, right, that makes us who we are. So laughter is an exclusively human phenomenon, according to Bergson. It's also a communal phenomenon because we're laughing at things that we share together. He says we have to be aware of our place in the world, because if we're not, we're unable to maintain that balance between tension and elasticity. We need to be able to kind of stick handle and roll with the punches and all these other metaphors we use to understand somebody that can kind of, navigate through some issues. So if we can do that, we tend to have a sense of humor, right? Because we can identify issues as what they really are, right? They're not a big deal. Those that are a big deal, let's set them aside and deal with them seriously like we should. But if we cannot maintain that balance between rigidity and elasticity, then that inability is what Bergson thinks is what is ripe for laughter. We can laugh at somebody that cannot maintain a balance between the two. So when we laugh at another person from that position of superiority, we are reminded about our humanity, the fact that we should be balanced between these two forces. So if we are tending towards rigidity, we tend to do the same thing over and over again, no matter what is happening. And the result is that we might hurt ourselves, hopefully not too much, or just embarrass ourselves. So when we're trying to do the same thing over and over again, when the situation is clearly changed, whether it's the weather or whether it's something else, or the floor is slippery, who knows? Whatever the situation is, if we are not responding in kind to the change in our environment, right? We're being elastic, but instead we're being rigid. Yeah, we might wipe out and somebody's going to laugh at us. So we need to be really careful. Now, ultimately, there is an interesting idea that John Morial presents to us in one of the books that is a recommended text, but not a test you have to read. But Morial talks about the mental rigidity of a tragic hero versus the mental flexibility of a comedic hero. And he says that the world that is presented in these two stories isn't fundamentally different. What is different is the way in which the hero responds to that world, right? The tragic view that we live in terms of inflexible, idealistic individuals, that will lead to tragedy, right? We're unwilling to change. But in the comic view, we're social beings. We get along with people. We're flexible, right? We can roll with those punches, and we can get around difficult situations. So that seems to be something that is very good. So on to Module 5. It's 27 minutes, not too bad. Hopefully we can do this in about 45 minutes. Okay, so Module 5, Incongruity, Theory of Humor. We looked at Francis Hutcheson, James Beattie, Kant, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and then finally Roger Scruton. They all essentially say the same thing. So this is what I meant earlier, the identify and explain or true, false, whatever. Worry less about who said what than what's being said. Okay, so Hutcheson is really the first person that presents this idea of incongruity as the coming together of things that are incompatible or incongruous. And the result of this incompatibility leads to laughter. So again, it's on a minor scale. It's not a major incongruity. It's not like suddenly we look out the window and, the laws of gravity are suddenly no longer applicable. That's pretty freaky. I wouldn't want to be going outside because for one thing, I'd be floating up to the ceiling. That's another issue. Okay, so the first person that really presents to us a significant theory of incongruity that really now still works is actually James Beattie, who says, not only is it a coming together of things that are incompatible, but here's the important part, a deviation, right? A deviation from some presupposed norm or expectation. That's where the humor lies. So again, humor is a psychological function, because we have to consider the deviation from the presupposed norm. And that norm we have to contain and have within ourselves because we live in a community, like we're social beings, we live in a certain place, we know the rules. We know the way things should be. So along comes somebody else and is acting very bizarre only to the degree that it's funny. Their behavior is not frightening, it's just simply funny. But we know there is a presupposed norm that this person is either not aware of or simply not following. And Beattie says that deviation is what the humor is. Kant talks a little bit about the joke, working in a three-part section, and we have an unexpected punchline. So we have a narrative that's built up, and we expect the joke to end up in a certain way. And this has a lot to do with relief theory as well. But Kant presents this notion of a three-part joke. The premise is established in the first part. The premise is then reinforced in the second part. And because it's been reinforced, you're expecting it to be reinforced again in the third part. But no, there's that weird little twist, right? The punchline. And whoa, okay, the presupposed norm, right? We were expecting something in the third part and it didn't happen. Now, this is distinct from Roger Scruton, who says, no, we know that's happening. That makes the joke congruous, right? But we'll get to that. So Immanuel Kant talks about sort of things that are irrational or strange, but fit within that the three-part structure of a joke. But that strained expectation, right? That incongruity, that strained expectation that we're expecting something and it's something else. That something else, that's where the humor lies. And again, on a sliding scale. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, two sort of, well, definitely not idealist philosophers, but certainly influenced by idealism, especially out of Germany. These guys had their feet on the ground, they not their heads in the clouds. And both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard really look at the world in similar ways, which is that we each have a version of what we think the world should be, right? Those presupposed norms. We carry those norms and expectations in our head. And we look and things don't quite match up to the way they should be, right? Things aren't exactly as we expected or we're hoping. Well, again, that deviation, that presupposed norm that is shifted over, it is always the source of humor. It is if it is mild. If it's a drastic deviation, that's something else. That's cause for concern. But both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard see the world as less than ideal, less than perfect. And so if we know what the norms are and we see the way in which they're actually played out, does that cause us concern? No, it causes us laughter because the deviation is minor. So the success of humor for both of them depends on cultural factors and a shared understanding of the world. That's why humor from other communities and other countries don't always translate well. They could be very funny jokes in that particular culture, in that milieu, we'll say, but they don't export well because it could be a joke about a particular behavior that is expected with people, and we don't know about it. So we're not in on the joke in the sense that we're not in on the norms. So it does happen where the joke falls flat to us, not because it isn't funny, but because we don't know what those presupposed norms are about. And this is how incongruity humor works. We have to know the circumstances. You know, what would have occurred otherwise for it not to be funny? And then you see what's happening. Now, if somebody were to explain it to you first and then tell you the joke, sure, it might be funny. But we have to have those expectations in our heads in order for us to understand that something that is occurring in front of us or we are reading about is in fact funny in the first place. Now, so that's Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. And the last person we talked about was Roger Scruton, who talks about the content of humor is congruity, that we typically don't enjoy incongruity. We don't enjoy irrationality. It does offend our sense of decency and logic. That's really who we are. We're not big fans of incongruity. We don't want to live in the purge every day. So really, that's what he's saying. Because he says, look, incongruities actually terrify us. Let's be honest. And if that's the case, then it's the punchline that because we know it is a punchline that kind of brings everything back, right? We know the structure of the joke. The form of the joke is actually reassuring. We know that the third part might be a little weird, but it's the form of the joke that keeps us in that, the realm of the congruous. We know what to expect. And that's essentially what he's saying. Okay, so the last one here, relief theory. I think we're going to be doing okay. This is one that does have a fair amount of overlap with incongruity. And essentially what relief theory is laughter that's an individual releasing of pent-up energy, right? This is a little bit of Descartes, the superiority theory, that plosive, aggressive form of laughter. Well, the pent-up release of energy in relief theory is really pretty well the same thing. So a fair amount of overlap in this stuff. So it liberates the energy that is otherwise expended by rationality to hold in our heads, right? That view of the world that Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard say that we should. And so that's kind of essentially what it is. Now here we looked at three people, Herbert Spencer, Sigmund Freud, and Mikhail Bakhtin. Okay, so Spencer is the first person out of the gate writing in roughly 1860. And he talks about laughter as the release of pent-up nervous energy, the fact that built-up tension is created by the anticipation, right, of what we are going to expect next. So there's Scruton's idea of the congruous nature of a three-part joke. Then we have also, Kant talking about the way in which the joke sets up an expectation that is deflated, right? It's a build up to nothing. So Spencer talks about that in really kind of the same way. So that buildup of energy is just, right? It's released through laughter. That plosive release of energy is what happens. A buildup of energy, of tension, is created by the anticipation of what we think is going to happen next. But if we know it's a joke, our anticipation is pretty well wide open. We don't know what to expect. So that nervous energy that's created by the narrative is suddenly discarded, right? Because the narrative is very short-lived. And it's discarded in the form of laughter. We just simply laugh it off, right? So this view, as interesting as it is also kind of mechanical and hydraulic, much like Descartes. And this was a kind of metaphor used in science since about the 1600s, the scientific revolution, which follows the Renaissance period. So by the late 1500s, early 1600s, people are looking at the world mechanically, right? They're thinking of the world in these kind of mechanical or hydraulic sort of views of the world. We don't do that anymore. So it's not a very common or really an effective way to look at things. Any of this kind of stuff should be looked at as sort of metaphoric at best. So at least here, Spencer explains to us why the punchline is as effective as it is. It does release the energy that's been built up that we invest in that short narrative of the three-part joke, and then poof, right? It's expended into nothing. But the nothing still results in laughter. So Freud takes Spencer's ideas and kind of reworks it a little bit more. And he does talk about laughter as a release of psychic energy rather than pent-up energy. This has more to do with the way that Freud had structured the mind in three parts, the id, the ego, and the superego. But don't worry about that. But it's just psychic energy. And what he means by that is the energy that is expended in being a rational person. Keeping a lid on things that are repressed, maintaining a sense of decorum and, following norms. And that's the superego that's at work. Because if you follow Freud, the superego is telling the ego to behave in a certain way. But down in the basement, there's all kinds of, weird gribbliches and monsters that want to come out, and id-like creatures that want to sort of run all over the place and cause havoc. We got to kind of put a lid on those. That's psychic energy. That's us putting a lid on the things that we don't want to talk about and think about. So comedy provides or humor as well, but comedy provides an escape from the demands that we have put on ourselves to be rational and reasonable creatures. That's essentially what he's saying. So, and especially if the joke turns out to be trivial. Now, taboo jokes, which is what Freud writes about, he says that the joke teller needs an audience in order to validate the joke telling in the first place. And even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that taboo jokes are funnier than regular jokes. That's a really kind of interpretation. Innocent jokes can be just as funny and just as clever. But in the same way that Spencer talks about the mind in this kind of mechanical, hydraulic sort of way of releasing of pressure, building up pressure, Freud is also guilty of that. He certainly took science in a different direction, but his ideas still suffer from the same sort of metaphor that is not the best in the world. We've advanced from that. So it's just not a way we describe things anymore. And this is the guy that came up with a three-part section, a three-part understanding of the mind. So it's still there. It lingers in the background. But what's important is the way in which the psychic energy that we normally expend to put a lid on things, right, to keep away repressed thoughts, usually sexual in nature, we keep those sort of out of public discourse, but periodically we allow them to escape in the realm of a joke, right? So we can acknowledge that, yeah, we have these feelings sometimes, and then we put a lid on it. So Freud believes that a person that can open and close that lid at will is a mentally healthy person. So jokes and laughter are still healthy and good because we exercise that psychic energy more effectively. Now, the last person we looked at, and we'll just wrap up here, is Mikhail Bakhtin. And Bakhtin comes up with a similar idea that Spencer and Freud present to us, which is, again, this idea of the releasing of pent-up energy. Now, when it comes to society, that kind of pent-up energy, if it isn't diffused or dissipated or sublimated is another word that Freud would use. If it isn't channeled, right, channeled into something else, it can become dangerous. Civil unrest, right, can destroy society. It can attack social institutions. And so Bakhtin looks at humor in much the same way. Instead of an individual releasing pent-up energy, psychic or otherwise, which is what Spencer and Freud are arguing, Bakhtin is saying that an entire society can benefit from allowing that to happen. And the way in which they do it is by having things like what he called the carnival. The carnival is where society kind of lets off steam. It's like a social safety valve almost. And this is a healthy thing. I think I mentioned in the slides, the only example I can think of these days is Halloween, where the world is literally turned upside down temporarily for one night. And boys and girls and that should be in bed, and, it's dark and outside, and they go to strangers' homes and they ask for candy, like all the things they shouldn't do, and we allow them to do it. But adults can also enjoy it and dress up. Men can dress up as women and vice versa. You can dress up as all kinds of, sexy whatever. But the point is, the world is temporarily turned upside down. And Bakhtin would look at this as a socially healthy thing. So to diffuse some of that otherwise pent-up energy is actually a very good thing. So carnival behavior, we need to keep in mind, if it were to occur anywhere else, would be bordering on criminal, because carnivalistic behavior involves sometimes violence and sexual behavior. Now, of course, the carnival that Bakhtin was writing about, this was really closely associated with rural communities and agrarian communities in Western Europe, back in the 1500s, where farming really was a very, very important component of everyday life. If you did not have a good harvest, you might starve to death. So there was tremendous pressure on farmers to do well. And there would be all kinds of ceremonies and sacrifices and festivals and ceremonies to celebrate the fact that there was going to be a good harvest. And carnival was one of them. It was a time of excess, right? Excessive behavior, gluttony, sexual behavior, drinking, all these kinds of things. And then right after that would be Lent, right? So you now atone and you eat just a little bit. You eat to stay alive as you lead up to, Easter. So these kinds of things, they were much more part of that fabric, that social fabric back in the 15 to 1600s than it is now. That's why I say, with the exception of Halloween, I cannot think of another time in our social history, let's say over the last couple hundred years, where we do anything that even remotely resembles carnival. So carnival, the standard codes, conventions, and laws that we would normally adhere to in everyday society are literally turned upside down. They are temporarily set aside. So imagine a stand-up comic in a comedy club. Imagine that being the carnival space, right? So the comedian says all kinds of rude things and we laugh because we recognize them as rude, but we know that that's not the way we would talk in, mixed company anywhere else. So that's where that relationship comes from. Now, carnival is very effective in diffusing and sublimating these kinds of excessive behaviors. But there's always the possibility, and Bakhtin thought this way, that there was always the possibility for maybe revolutionary behavior. But if you break apart society through revolution, you then break apart the moment where carnival can be allowed to exist. And typically, following a revolution, you get a clampdown, right? You want to clamp down on the enemies of the state, for example. Well, carnival would be the last thing that would be allowed. So we need to be very careful about the notion of it being revolutionary. The way it's structured is it is part and parcel of social everyday life. That's the way Bakhtin described it, and that's the way that it existed back in these agrarian communities. We don't have that as much. If anything, we simply have what I described, Halloween or a stand-up comedy club, where we know that when we enter into that space, that's what we're going to expect. We're going to expect people to, make fun of all kinds of things. It's up to them to be funny, but it's also up to us to say, no, you're not funny. I'm leaving. Okay, so that's pretty well it. That's the gist of the main points. We did it in just about 45 minutes. Again, online midterm test. We're going to meet on Monday for sure. You can ask more questions. Available from the 22nd to the 27th. 120 minutes, 4 sections, true, false, identify and explain, short answer questions, plural, and 1 long answer question of which you have a choice. So I'm going to end it here, but I will see you again on Monday. Have a good weekend. We'll see each other in about a day and a half because it's already Saturday evening. So take care, and we'll talk to you soon.